at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, we rely on a network of collaborations with people and institutions from around the world to explore major questions in human origins and societal change.
These global partnerships span dozens of countries and allow us to combine cutting-edge field and laboratory analyses to formulate new ways of understanding the past.
On this web series, we'll talk with our international partners to hear about their interest in archaeology, their research, and their vision for the sustainability of archaeological research in the future.
This is ArchaeoChats. Hello and welcome back to ArchaeoChats. I'm Robert Padalano, and as always, I'm joined by Emma Feinstone. We have a great episode today and are extremely excited to be joined by Dr. Yoshi Maezumi. Yoshi is a paleoecologist specializing in the legacy of human land use and fire management in modern ecosystems. She is the Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Amsterdam and principal investigator of the Fire Intensity in Rainforest Ecotones, or FIRE project, which examines the role of fire in shaping Amazon rainforest savanna ecotones. Dr. Maezumi's research often includes a multi-proxy toolkit, but her two main focus areas are macro charcoal and pollen analyses for the reconstruction of past human-environment interactions. She combines archaeology and paleoclimate data to tell the story of plant cultivation, domestication, and the spread of food production in tropical South America. Today, she will also tell us about a few of her new projects that will take her out of the Amazon and into Africa, Australia, and North America. Dr. Maezumi, welcome to ArchaeoChats.
Thanks so much for having me, you guys. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us. So, how did your interest in archaeology develop early on in your academic career?
So my first experience with archaeology happened in high school. As a senior elective, you could take like an anthropology and archaeology course, and our senior project was an archaeology weekend field school and field excavation. And so my mom and I went out to an archaeological site known as Calico in the deserts of California, and we did a little weekend excavation for that project. My first dig, right? And I'm very excited about it, and I'm digging like for my 6 hours or whatever, and like come to a layer and I see like this bright greenish color stone. Keep digging. Now you can imagine the anticipation when you're digging your little one by one. Wind up excavating a scraper tool, and so then of course in my mind, here's my little tool, get a picture with it and go home and write my report, and I loved it. So kind of planted the seed of my interest in archaeology.
You have quite a unique skill set, including techniques in archaeology, paleoecology, and religious studies. Maybe you can tell us a bit about how these three disciplines overlap in your research and how you've used them over the last few years.
Yeah, so the religious studies was kind of an add-on. So I wound up going to undergraduate for archaeology, and then in one of my field schools, we were doing excavations in the Negev Desert in Jordan. And those excavations were led by Tom Levy, who's a biblical archaeologist. And so he was very interested in kind of the juncture between religious studies and archaeology. And I think after that, I got more interested in how human environment interactions work. And so I'm less obviously focused on the religious studies part of things, but it was kind of just an interesting topic and really interesting courses. I wound up doing a study abroad in Rome, and there were classes on science and religion taught by Jesuit priests. It was a really neat conglomeration of different kinds of classes.
That sounds really
not
cool.
super relevant. I don't use that degree now, but interesting stuff.
No, but it sounds fascinating. Whether or not you use it now, I mean, it does sound quite different than I think some of the stuff we're typically used to, at least at Max Planck.
Yeah, I was going to say, I actually did a study abroad in Rome too, and it was the archaeology from the early Roman Empire, but then all the way up to present. Rome is just such an amazing city. I don't use it at all now either, but it's kind of a cool experience.
Yoshi, you've been involved in a number of projects over the last few years. But there are a few that really stand out that I was hoping that you'd tell our listeners about. The first one is the FIRE project, Fire Intensity in Rainforest Ecosystems. Then there's the Islander one, which is the island sustainability, the legacy of anthropogenic and natural disturbance of ecological resources. So those are the two that I hope you can touch upon. And then I think you had let us know that there's a new project that just got funding by National Geographic, the PF Fire project. Maybe you'd like to just speak on sort of the goals and objectives, how the projects overlap in terms of the questions they're asking, and maybe some of the results, just to give our listeners a bit more about, these really cool projects you're involved with.
Yeah, happy to. So really, all of these projects have a common thing that we're really interested in how Indigenous populations in the past used fire and how that fire and changes in land use practices influenced the ecosystems. And then can we see these changes in the past that are still like legacy effects for today's modern systems? And so the 4 projects that you mentioned are looking at this kind of human fire interactions in 4 different locations. The first project, Fire, is that Maimira Curie ongoing project that I'm based at the University of Amsterdam, working with Will Gosling and Crystal McMichael. And that project's looking at different aspects of how fires changed in the past and how those changes in fire shaped these ecotonal regions. So what ecotones are is basically where you have the rainforest ecosystem kind of transitioning into more open seasonal dry forest or savanna ecosystems. Through time, evolutionarily speaking, this ecotone region is really dynamic and it'll respond to natural changes in climate and that kind of thing. And as you move into more dry ecosystems, fire becomes a natural component of the landscape, right? So if you strike a lightning strike in dry forest, it's really easy for those forests to catch on fire as opposed to your rainforest, right? So you have fire playing a really important role in the dynamics of these ecosystems, these ecotones. And one of the key components of this project is looking at a new technique to measure what's called fire intensity. And we're roughly defining this as the temperatures of fire. So basically, you can imagine if a fire gets really hot, it's going to have more negative effects on the ecosystem because it can kill the soils and it can kill the microbes and it can wipe out all the seed banks. And so the ecosystem has a harder time recovering post-fire. Whereas less hot fires, you might have like kind of just go through and clear the underbrush, but the kind of main forest stays intact. So we're trying to develop a technique to measure this fire temperatures in the past. And we're using a new technique called Fourier trans-infrared microscopy or spectroscopy. And basically what this does is use a really fancy microscope with laser beams to get an infrared signature of the charcoal. And it'll give you an indication of temperatures fires are burning. So those papers are in reviews like right now, so fingers crossed that they go well.
Just real quick, sorry. I know a few studies that have used polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They're a type of fire biomarker. And depending on the molecular weight, if they're heavier or lighter, it can give you an idea of temperature of the fire burning. And they've been used to look at, natural versus man-made fires in cave sites in the Pleistocene for human or Neanderthal occupied cave sites. So.
Super cool. Did you want me to move on to the next project? Any more about?
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Sorry.
Okay, no, not at all. So the project Islander is working in islands, big stretch there. And this project is based in Curaçao, which is one of the Dutch Caribbean islands located just north of Venezuela. And what's really interesting about the Caribbean islands is that it has a very dynamic, diverse human history, right? So if you imagine, we're zooming into the Caribbean island section, we kind of have our westward, our Western Antilles Islands and moving into the Eastern Antilles. And the human history throughout these islands is really complicated, right? So it's not like there's just one wave of migration that all the islands are occupied. It seems like there's numerous human introductions or human occupation histories that come through the islands, starting as early as sometimes 8,000, 7,000 years ago, particularly on the islands close to the continent. And then we kind of have these post-wave migrations of people moving onto different islands throughout the last, let's say, 6,000 years. And so my first project down there was actually a National Geographic project based in Jamaica, which interestingly is one of the last islands colonized. So where you have a neighboring island, let's say, Puerto Rico, Cuba, just north of Jamaica, you have human history there for, let's say, 3,000 or 4,000 years longer than you do Jamaica. And so you can start to compare like differences between land use and human occupation over here, where you don't have, kind of an island in isolation from humans. And so that's kind of what one of those projects are looking at. And then over in Curaçao, it's one of our earlier occupied sites. Again, it's closer to the continent, so people get there earlier. But both of those projects are going to be looking at human occupation, what happens when people arrive, do they change how fire activity is behaving on the island? Was there no fire and now there's people, so there's fire kind of thing? And then how do the ecosystems, these small isolated ecosystems, respond to these changes in disturbance regimes?
Cool. Sounds really fascinating.
So my question is about how working in the Amazon, it's not typically what we think of as the sort of environment that people are doing archaeology in. I imagine it's a difficult place to work in some respects, maybe in terms of preservation, in terms of identifying potential archaeological sites. It has its probably unique challenges. So I was wondering, what are some of the highlights and some of the challenges of working in the tropics, or rather specifically in the Amazon?
Okay, fun question. So as you mentioned, preservation is a big issue, right? So things are moist and wet all the time in the jungle. And so often anything organic is going to degrade really quickly. So a lot of the structures, architectural features, textiles, material remains do degrade. We don't have evidence really left over of those in a lot of our, let's see, lowland Amazonian environments. But what we do have, ceramics, lots of different types of ceramics that are preserved quite well. A very iconic anthropogenic soil known as Amazon dark earth soils. And basically these are nutrient-enriched soils that are associated with human permanent occupation or settlement. In terms of lakes, kind of thinking then towards more of the ecology side of things, there's not that many lakes in the Amazon, and the lakes that are there are pretty dispersed. You imagine it's quite flat, and then you have these, huge meandering rivers that kind of change course quite often, and they just kind of wander through the Amazon basin towards the Atlantic. And so oftentimes if you had, a kind of a lakeish setting, it could get flooded really easy or kind of washed away by the river as it changes course. And so it's quite difficult to find these lake sites. But I think as more and more research is being done in the Amazon, we're starting to fill in the map where we had, sites, big blanks on the map before. There's big research projects going in on all over the Amazon now to try and to fill in the blanks on the map that we have currently.
Do you have any interesting field story from working in the Amazon that our listeners might be interested in?
Yeah, so I was thinking about one of these, we were talking about kind of how lakes aren't so common on the landscape, right? So to get to some of these lakes that we do find, it can be really, really, really remote locations. So this might mean 3 flights to a chartered plane to another 4-hour, 5-hour boat ride or something like that to get to this, particular lake site where we want to do archaeology in Lake Horing. And so at one of these particular sites in the very remote regions of the northeastern part of the Bolivian Amazon, we had, I think, gotten off the boat. We were setting up camp, and then we had to hike another couple hours to get to the site. And it was hiking through swamp water that's kind of chest deep and such like that. Really amazing, beautiful remote locations. But at that was probably the hardest field site I've worked in. The little rubber boats you get at Target or whatever. It's a 2-person boat that you'd row around your backyard lake with. So one of my colleagues, Mark Robinson, and I were sitting in this boat, and one of the women in the village is you guys can't put a rubber boat on that lake. There's piranha in there, and there's crocodile. You can't just go in a little rubber dinghy. And we were just, of course, so halfway across the lake, Mark and I are doing bathymetry surveys on this lake, rowing across, and this big crocodile we just kind of see off in the distance getting closer. Obviously it didn't eat us. It was very curious though, so we came back to shore. It was from me to a stone's throw right there, just kind of looking at the boat can I eat that? I don't know. And in that same lake, yeah, we can fish for piranha, and we're eating it a piranha stew and things like that. So it's deceptively peaceful and calm, and then all of a sudden, you hear something that sounds like they turned on a blender underneath the water, and it's the piranha are just eating something and going to their little piranha frenzy. It was fun, very memorable, beautiful.
What does piranha taste like?
So it's bony, they're not super big fish, and they're kind of flat, and they have these long, obviously, ribs that run down. So tastes maybe a plain whitefish. Cod, maybe, but maybe a little more meaty because they're carnivorous, so they're eating. But yeah, it was tasty. I basically just boil it in a pot with onions and garlic and made a stew out of it, and yeah, it was fine.
It was fine. Awesome. So let's talk a bit about your connection with the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. I think you've become a member of Patrick Roberts' ERC-funded project Panthropocene. And then you just gave a talk for the Rainforest Redux that's hosted by Dr. Eleanor Series' Pan-African Evolution Research Group. How would you say your research in the Amazon parallels the Pan-EBS group's research throughout Africa?
So if you're just kind of looking at our traditional map of the world, you basically have South America and Africa, kind of similar size continents, similar expanses of tropical rainforest within these massive continents. And so there's been a lot of synergy and efforts in the past and currently ongoing to draw parallels between environmental change, ecological change, human histories between these two massive continents. Now, the human history is very timescales are very different in Africa versus South America. But as far as human environment interactions go, let's say at least zooming into the last 15,000, 20,000 years, something like that, we can, I think, start to draw some neat parallels. As you mentioned, this pantropic project is looking at how humans are interacting with the environment all throughout the tropics. And so there's a lot of neat overlapping information, synergies that are available there. Potentially some of the strategies and methodologies we've been using in South America could be applied to future research going on in Africa. Both places can be very difficult to conduct field research. And so we have been making some nice advances in these interdisciplinary projects, these big kind of multidisciplinary projects in South America that could potentially, provide insights for how those teams and collaborative work can be done in Africa in the future.
Yeah, I think it's so important to work outside of just your geographic area and share strategies for some of the same challenges that exist in tropical forests in Africa as in the Amazon. So as a follow-up question, you focus on tropical forests, but I'm wondering how your research can be useful, in some way informative, for other archaeological or environmental settings other than tropical forests. Any ideas about that?
Yeah, great. And this actually kind of ties into earlier, Bob, you asked about the PF Fire project. So this project is actually based in Australia. And so as I mentioned, the commonality between these different projects are looking at human fire interactions in the past, particularly in this project. It's looking at traditional Aboriginal styles of burning in Australia, which we know have been there for very, very, very long, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The arrival of British colonialism and the changes in Indigenous land use practices through the colonial period and how that has influenced the modern Australian forests. So, the 2019 brush fires in Australia were massive, some of the largest documented in the historical record, as well as in the paleoecological record as well. And really, we're trying to understand what's the influence of humans and these different kinds of human land use interactions and Indigenous and then the colonial that have kind of set up the stage for what kind of fuels we have on landscape, what forests are there to burn, and how potentially these forests can be managed in a way that will be helping to avoid these massive mega fires that we saw in the 2019 fire season.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. Adopting these practices elsewhere. I think that's going to be huge for you going down the line. You on your website call yourself an academic nomad, and I think any academic listening to this will know exactly what you mean right away. But could you please describe what you consider an academic nomad is, and really the challenges associated with being an early career research postdoc?
Yeah. So I think I wrote a blog on my birthday a year or two ago, because I think it was like the fourth birthday I'd been like alone and in just like a week of moving to a new country for years. And so, I mean, like think in the last, let's see, since 2015, I've lived in 4 countries for different postdocs. And then I taught for a year in Jamaica at the University of the West Indies. I bounced back to Amsterdam for my Marie Curie, and now I'm currently in California, staying with my family during COVID. So it's been really just kind of all over the map. And I think this idea of academic nomads is, we love what we do. I really want to continue doing research, but we have to go where the jobs are. And because, our fields are quite specialized, and I think this actually applies to anybody doing any kind of research or science, that you typically need to, relocate and go where the jobs are. But as you mentioned, it can be really challenging. I think this life of constant moving.
Yeah, I mean, emotionally, physically, mentally, right? It's a challenging career we've chosen.
Yeah, when we choose to be archaeologists, it's part of the appeal is that you get to travel, but it really is like such a nomadic lifestyle that it's a challenge sometimes. Usually we ask what our guest advice is for people looking to get into the field, but we're going to change the question a little bit this time.
Okay.
So I'm wondering what your advice is for other early career researchers, because Bob and I are early career researchers. You are too, and you've been very successful in getting a lot of grants and developing these great projects that are getting funding and getting a lot of just positions everywhere. I mean, you're really an example of an early career researcher who's really making a mark in the field, doing a lot of interesting research. So what's your advice?
Oh, I think so. It's like, very flattered for those nice words. So let's see, advice. So I think we all love what we do, and it's really easy for us to say yes to lots of different opportunities. And I think that's one of the best things. I think I love people. I love the people I get to work with and collaborate with, and just, being willing to go out and, meet people, go to different conferences. And I think something that I definitely wanted to mention is that, along with the relocating, the academic nomad thing, and then loving our job and putting 120% into what we're doing, trying to find a work-life balance. And so that's kind of what I've been really working on in the last year, especially now that we're kind of more senior, we're getting towards more senior ECRs. Like, you can definitely reach burnout. And so it's trying to find, like, okay, definitely take time off, have hours set that you're trying to separate from work, not check your email on your phone every 5 minutes and that kind of thing. And it's baby steps, because I'm obviously not very good at it, but I am trying to have a better work-life balance. And so that's not like all consuming. Make sure you get off your desk, go exercise, eat good food, sleep, basics.
Yeah,
but
I think with COVID, one thing it really made me realize is, there are other things going on, other more important things going on than strictly focusing on work or whatever. And I think this last year has really opened my mind to that you have family responsibilities and responsibilities to friends and whatever, and that makes maybe should come first sometimes.
So what would you like to see for the future of paleoecology and archaeology in the Amazon or at other tropical locations? What's your vision for where the future should go?
Well, I think we're making great strides towards really making science interdisciplinary. And I think that there's what I've learned, particularly since I started my postdoc that was in an archaeology department, so kind of bouncing back and forth between archaeology, physical geography, paleoecology, back to archaeology, is how beneficial it is to have a really diverse team. We had somebody who's expert in big data and GIS. We had somebody who's a master digger, like the one of the best archaeologists I've worked with in the field, can just see things that other eyes don't see. People who are amazing at botany, botanical stuff, they can look at almost any tree in a vegetation plot and know what it is, know what time it's going to flower, like all sorts of like really important ecological things that we can then all collaborate together and really start to understand a better picture of what's going on in the past. And so I think that these kinds of interdisciplinary fields, the more that we can get different perspectives, the amount of information that we can gather from these different types of data sets is really, really powerful. And so I'd love to see that kind of science going on in all tropical systems. Might be a few years off, but we can at least work towards that and continue working towards that.
Awesome. Before we do our Archeo quiz, Emma, I just want to let our listeners know that Yoshi and I are actually going to start hosting a podcast for the Pantropica project. We just want to kind of use this as a new platform to get early career researchers the ability to talk about their research. So shameless self-plug for Yoshi and I.
That's awesome.
Yeah, maybe in a few months we'll be ready. Okay, finally, our last thing that we typically do. Emma, Yoshi owns a business, we'll call it. So in our multiple choices here, what does Yoshi own or manage or run? A, is it a pizza shop? B, a bakery? C, a yoga studio? Or D, a cat cafe?
I hope it's a cat cafe. I'm gonna guess bakery.
Yoshi, would you like to answer the question for us?
It's a yoga studio, the yoga business anyway.
That's awesome. So that's your work-life balance.
Exactly. Yep. I wish I had a cat cafe though. Maybe that's my next work-life balance step.
There was one in Calgary and it was fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Super. Yeah, thanks you guys. Have a great weekend, okay?
Yeah, you too.
You too.
Bye.